Hey everyone, Chris here, and I want to go ahead and explain why the concept of pansexuality is not a sexual orientation with very basic biological and sociological points with a few hypothetical scenarios sprinkled about. To start, we have to go ahead and explain what a sexual orientation is, and that's very simple to do actually. A sexual orientation is your inherent or immutable sexual attraction to other people, meaning it is a matter of biological factors and not something that a person can choose to change. We have to remember this going forward. Your sexual orientation is not a choice, you have it from birth, prior to socialization. Now, many people have tried to change the definition of sexual orientation with the inclusion of gender, meaning that it is a person's inherent or immutable sexual attraction to other people in terms of either their sex or gender. But this doesn't work and it just muddles the definition even further. You see, your sex is your biological profile in terms of your chromosomes and sexual organs, whereas your gender is an ascribed status based upon the ideals of the culture in which you were given the status. And an ascribed status is just that, it's one that you're given for whatever reason and based upon whatever variables the power it be choose to base your status off of. Many people do not like the gender that they're given at birth and find themselves doubting the way in which they were socialized into the role they were given. And this is perfectly fine, as your gender can be redefined by your own beliefs and values if you so decide, given the fact that beliefs and values are based upon whatever culture you identify with. If you decide that you do not agree with the folkways of the larger culture at hand, then you're completely justified in setting up your own subculture based upon the beliefs and values that you deem imperative to how you wish to identify. It should be noted, however, that your system of beliefs is not the majority, and you can't expect the larger established culture that you're living in to change their patterns of speech or thought based upon your subculture. Additionally, the larger culture at hand should respect your newly discovered subculture as much as possible. There is nothing wrong with someone that identifies as a man even though they were socialized as a woman. Gender is based upon a series of social qualifications, and as such, these variables can change dependent upon the person and system in which the gender is being discussed. I've said so much on gender as I wanted to have a clear understanding of what gender is going into the rest of the video, but also to help us have a grounded understanding of what gender is because it seems that many people confuse gender and sex, or at the very least, they tend to speak as if the two were interchangeable when they're simply not. Your sex can't change. It is a constant from the day your biological profile is established. You're either male, female, or intersex. Your gender can be changed as many times as you like. It's completely up to you. The only variable is your comfort level. We say I'm a man or I'm a woman because we're taught, at least in most industrial societies for this example, that these are the genders at hand. There have been examples of civilizations that didn't have the concept of gender as we know it, or at the very least, they didn't focus on it as much. A very simple example would be John. John is starting a culture on an island off the shore of Japan. John chooses not to introduce the concept of boy and girl, or even man and woman for that matter. He completely bypasses the socialization that we know of in favor of something simpler. The genders we know will not exist in John's new culture. They may resemble what we know, but they will not be so easily applicable within our understanding. As previously stated, sexual orientation is a biological function. It is what you're driven to seek out in terms of a mate. As a heterosexual male, for example, I am driven to populate the world and increase the numbers of both my species and bloodline, and as such, I feel the need to seek out a female to breed with because I want her to make children for me. It's simple. Gender plays no part in that attraction. However, gender is a very loaded concept in terms of how it's observable on a person, but we'll keep it simple for the sake of discussion. A female was given the gender girl at birth, and later she becomes a woman based on what our society deems a woman. As such, they've kind of cut her hair a certain way and they've kept it long. They've taught her to wear makeup or wear certain clothing that we associate with the gender. However, I am not sexually attracted to her gender. Even if I'm socialized to associate her appearance as a woman with that of a biological female, my sexual attraction will still boil down to her reproductive organs. Quite simply, it comes down to looking for certain equipment. I bring this up as gender is such a non-factor in a sexual orientation scenario. Picture a straight male in a society where their ideas of gender are the opposite of our own. meaning that this straight male was raised as what we know to be a woman. He will find himself seeking out sexual contact with a biological female that acts as a boy within the society. Gender is only a variable and plays no part in sexual attraction. With that out of the way, we can get to the main focus of the discussion. There are three sexual orientations: heterosexual, those that are attracted to members of the opposite sex; homosexual, those that are attracted to members of the same sex, meaning gay or lesbian individuals; and bisexual, those attracted to either sex. Now, as I've done for the majority of the discussion, I'm going to continue to exclude intersex people from the discussion and focus on males and females. I'm not doing this out of a prejudice, but instead to keep this heavily talked about sociological and biological discussion a tad more streamlined. At the end of the day, an intersex person may be considered as such for a bevy of reasons, but their biological makeup still boils down to the X and Y chromosomes. And if you wish to learn more about intersex people, then I highly recommend that you do, because it is a very interesting aspect of reproduction. The definition of pansexuality that I have seen the most reads: the capability of attraction to others regardless of their gender identity or biological sex. A pansexual could be open to someone who is male, female, transgender, intersex, and or agendered slash genderqueer. Obviously, that is a very loaded definition, and I'm going to break it down piece by piece for the sake of the discussion here. First and foremost, a person who is agendered finds themselves not identifying with a gender at all, whereas a person who is genderqueer, they do not really subscribe to gender distinctions, but they might identify with both, neither, or a combination of what we know as the male and female genders. There is nothing wrong with either of these concepts, and in fact, I find them very interesting, considering that the concept of genderqueer is, again, very much dependent upon the society and culture in which the sample is located. As mentioned earlier, with that hypothetical genderless society that the man created, a person couldn't be genderqueer in that society, or even agendered for that matter, because there would be no concept of gender with which to differ from or abstain from identifying with. Talk to someone who is agendered or genderqueer the next time you get a chance, because it's always good to learn from a subculture. Now, a subculture is simply a segment of society that shares a pattern, folkways, and values that differ from the larger society, as I mentioned earlier. So, I forgot to mention, it is not a negative term, but instead a very imperative term that allows us to recognize people's differences and needs based upon the culture that they belong to. Moving on to the rest of the terms mentioned in the definition of pansexuality that we were given, we have transgender. A transgender person is someone whose gender differs from the one that they were assigned at birth. Perhaps Cassandra reached a point in her life where she came to terms with the fact that she didn't identify as a woman, but that she instead wanted to rejoin society as someone who identifies as a man in terms of how we know a man to be. As stated earlier, this is perfectly fine, but it doesn't change your sex. Gender does not play into your sexual orientation, as your orientation is a matter of biological makeup, whereas gender is a matter of your socialization. You are socialized after your gender makeup is established. We can remove all mentions of gender in the definition of pansexuality, which would now read something like the capability of attraction to others regardless of their biological sex. A pansexual could be open to someone who is male, female, or intersex. Once we removed all mentions of the concept of gender, we're left with a definition that is almost identical to that of bisexuality in terms of content. This isn't a mistake, as it's leading us to our ultimate point of discussion here, in that pansexuality is not a biologically occurring sexual orientation. Now, before I demonstrate how this doesn't exist with a scenario that I use in class from time to time for other topics, I want to clear something up that I'm sure many will introduce into the discussion as a means to counter this point. You may not care what gender a person is, but at some point your sexual orientation, meaning one of the three previously laid out, will come into play. It doesn't matter if your partner is a genderqueer biological male or a transgendered biological female. You're either able to become sexually aroused by their sexual organs or you're not. And seeing as how that indicates either a penis or vagina, again excluding the various examples of intersex people, you can find out what your sexual orientation is based upon your sexual arousal and your own biological sex. Pansexuality is not a sexual orientation. It is a social construct. Imagine that we had three babies fresh out of the hospital, two males and one female. Now imagine that we place them into a room for the rest of their lives. At no point do we ever make the distinction to them that we view them differently, nor do we come even close to assigning gender roles. Meaning the concept of gender identity can't come into play, as gender identity is just that. It is based upon your gender and not your sex, which again is a constant. For pansexuality to exist as a sexual orientation that naturally occurs, we must find a scenario in which one of these three children would become pansexual. Now, say that we fast forward and these children become sexually aware in their pubescent years. One of the males notices that he is becoming sexually attracted to both of his siblings. Is this subject pansexual or bisexual? Seeing as how we've never introduced the concept of gender to these samples, his attraction is based solely on his orientation and not outside factors or gender identities. We have three humans in this situation, as close to their raw being as possible without the concepts that we've come to use in order to socialize our young within our society. Why can't the male who finds himself aroused by both siblings be pansexual? Because a sexual orientation is a matter of sexual organs, and factors such as gender and identity do not play into sexual orientations. Pansexuality is not a sexual orientation, as it cannot occur naturally outside of a social construct. It is something that we created and that we were not born with. Many of you watching this may have clicked on the video because you feel that you're pansexual, and you must be aware that this video is by no means an attack on you as a person, but instead a short and simple scientific analysis of pansexuality as a sexual orientation based upon what we know biologically and sociologically. You may pick your partner without attention to their gender or sex, and that is fine, and I cannot dispute that. But at the end of the day, you're either sexually attracted to their organs or you're not, meaning you're either homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual. Now, I welcome an open discussion in the comments section so long as it stays clear of rude language toward others who may differ from you. And that goes for both those who agree with my statements and those who are in opposition to them. When commenting, remember that this is a matter of observable science and not your opinion of what I simply said being wrong. You can't use the fact that you are X, Y, and Z as a credible source. Be sure to include thoughtful points that are scientifically based, either natural or social.